Hello, welcome back to Out on That Line podcast, and we are going to do another review for you this week. My name is Jeff, and I'm here with my co-host Alex. As always, Alex, how you doing this week?
Jeff, you might as well call me Ray Parker Jr. because bustin' makes me feel good. I'm excited to be back for another week and another review. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and let's get to cleaning up the town. So this week we're going to be talking about the new Death Cab for Cutie. Is it a coincidence I'm wearing this shirt? People can decide for themselves. But the new Death Cab for Cutie album, I Built You a Tower. Now, this one is, surprise, surprise, about a divorce by Ben Gibbard. Something that the man is known for doing is writing albums about that. He divorced Zooey Deschanel back in the day, made an all-time classic album out of that. And now he is recently divorced somebody he was married to for a long time, and I am forgetting what her name is. She's not super famous herself. She's also an artist. But that's where this album came from, is, a place of grief and that sort of thing. Basically, like, if you listen to any Death Cab for Cutie, Ben Gibbard is at his best when things aren't going so hot for him. I think that's the case for a lot of artists, but especially for him. Fun fact about this. So Chris Walla, that used to be in Death Cab for Cutie, but left the band because of tensions with Ben Gibbard, I think after the Kintsugi album, I think was after he left the band. The woman that Ben Gibbard just divorced way back in the day dated Chris Walla as well. Now, I don't think that's the source of the tension at all between them and why he left the band. It's just a, funny thing that world is probably pretty small up there in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, it sure sounds like everything is 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon up there. You're totally right. I think to me, to like expand on the thought, Death Cab music is at its best when the angst is coming from a genuine place, and not because it's expected, but because it's relevant. Like, there's a tendency with certain bands, if they're very emo or they're, Postal Service and Death Cab, not emo, but like fall into that borderline emo-esque attitude for indie music. There's a tendency to, like, through no fault of its own, become self-parody. Once Zach Braff uses you in a movie, unfortunately, you're going to get ripped on. Sorry, the Shins. But they're like, sort of certain point, the genre can kind of get a little flanderized and become like kind of a shell of itself. And I think that's kind of what happened with that, like, middle chunk Death Cab. I think Asphalt Meadows was the last one. And I remember thinking it was good when I listened to it the first couple times. I've gone back to it quite a few times and continue to find it really strong and really enjoyable, because what I think it is a return to authentic angst. Because back in the day when they were young and there were all these questions about the future, they were making really interesting music, the music and the lyrics. And now that they're older, there's a lot of nostalgia and a lot of questions about the past. It's causing a totally different kind of angst. So as the pendulum swings, as we come back around, whatever trajectory we're taking here, it moves back into that, like, planetary alignment of authenticity, which I think gave us a lot of really, really strong songs on this album.
Yeah, this album, I feel like if you're going to kind of compare it to other eras of Death Cab for Cutie, is like, so you had kind of the beginning, like, I would say what I consider like the pre-plans era up to Transatlanticism. So you had the photo album, we have the Facts for Voting Yes, we had Something About Airplanes, the Stability EP. So you had all these albums that were very indie, and I think they found a certain audience, but it was not a huge audience. Transatlanticism came out and started to really expand that a bit, and then Plans came out. I Will Follow You Into the Dark, Soul Meets Body, Crooked Teeth, like all those songs like blew up. So you had what I called starting at the Plans era with Plans, Narrow Stairs, Codes and Keys. Those albums I always consider kind of grouped together. Codes and Keys definitely for me like the weakest of the three. Plans is my favorite Death Cab album, just barely above Transatlanticism, but it is excellent top to bottom all the way through. I think one of the greatest indie albums ever created. Narrow Stairs is fantastic because they get to rock it a little more. It's a little happier. I think what I love about Plans is it is extremely heartbreaking. And like what Sarah said, Brothers on a Hotel Bed, Marching Bands of Manhattan. Like there's some really like heartbreaking songs on that album, and some of Ben Gibbard's like best clever songwriting, in the way he describes things. Crooked Teeth, like, that made the skyline look like crooked teeth in the mouth of a man that was devouring us both. Like, just what a cool line that is, right? And then you get in after that era, you get into like Thank You for Today, or sorry, you get into Kintsugi, Thank You for Today, and then you get like Asphalt Meadows. And I consider that era, kind of the same. Kintsugi and Thank You for Today, not really a huge fan of those. To me, those are the weakest two albums in the entire discography. Asphalt Meadows was where things started to come back. Saw that tour. That's what this shirt is from, is the Asphalt Meadows tour. I'm high on Asphalt Meadows. Like, that's not up there with like Transatlanticism and Plans, but it's probably right there with like Narrow Stairs and Codes and Keys for me. For me, it's a return to what I think Death Cab is kind of like supposed to sound like. Then we get into I Built You a Tower, and this is, I think, much more comparable to like the Photo album. We have the facts and we're voting yes. More of that like very indie, like kind of sometimes like these odd stuttering, almost time signatures involved with some of these songs. But then you get those big moments like you got with Narrow Stairs. Like Bixby Canyon Bridge was this huge sound once that song really got into it. And then You Are a Tourist, like that super long intro. But then when you get into actual like meat of the song, it's just such an expansive, produced, like sounding kind of album. I felt like that's where we got back to. So you get the mix of like the style of songwriting that you got with early Death Cab, kind of combined with that production quality of like those kind of middle albums before you get to the ones that I didn't really love. I don't know if you felt the same way.
Yeah, I think so I'm looking at this, the guy John Congleton, who produced this, has worked with, I'm looking at his Wikipedia page.
Laundry list.
Heavy hitters everywhere you look. Swing a Dead Cat. Clearly guy's got like something under the hood, and it works beautifully with Death Cab. I think the production on it, like the production on some Death Cab movie albums, like even like Transatlanticism and Plans, to me, there are moments where I look at like the mix in that, and it's not super consistent. Like the quality of the songwriting and the music is consistent, always there, but some of the production stuff, like there are I Will Follow You Into the Dark as like this stripped down acoustic moment. You got to nail one that totally nailed that. And I got like a similar flavor as this album started with Full of Stars. Just kind of a sobering beginning to the album and an indication of where we were going to go, which was kind of back to that. To me, this was like more than anything harkening back to the Transatlanticism and Plans, like 2003, 2005 stretch in terms of like the introspective lyrics and a lot of the musical ideas, because there was like the Ben Gibbard's voice and the delivery he has, like he still sounds like a young man, but he finds a way to also sound like a sad old man. But his voice is essentially unchanged. The flavor and the character is just coming from this new life experience and this horrible, like compartmentalized emotion that like comes spilling out. Like he was running like an ultra marathon at one point and just like broke down, like totally emotionally broke down because the divorce and all these other aspects of his life were coming to a head. Guy's what, 49 years old? So
yeah, he's got to be close to it at least.
So like hitting this whole new phase in your life, you no longer with your ostensible life partner at that age. It's just like all these like very, very big things hitting at once, and then taking that emotion and putting it through the same lens as Transatlanticism and Plans, like that era from 20 plus years ago. And tapping into that same source of anxiety that he does a really good job with painting a scene for you, like painting a picture that's perfectly evocative of the emotion. He doesn't have to tell you how devastated he is, because you can have a line about being too tired to fight the war, and that says it all. The concept of the tower, like this tower in your mind's landscape that represents your grief and every shitty thing that you've shoved in there and don't want to deal with. There's a lot of evocative imagery on this that, again, harkens back to the good old days, and it's honest. It's below the neck authenticity, and quite a few songs on this like really benefit from that perspective.
Yeah, I loved both the I Built You a Tower A and B. Like I really liked that there was like kind of two different versions of the same thing. Different names for the same thing, someone might say. Yeah. My knowledge of like I always say like Bruce Springsteen is, you know, my favorite artist of all time. Coheed and Cambria are one of my favorite artists of all time. Like I always say all these, like I almost never say Death Cab is, but I probably know more about Death Cab than I know about almost any other band that I listen to. So it's funny that I don't, you know, I should consider them one of my favorites of all time, because really truly they are. Like there's so many points of their discography I go back and listen to, so many favorites that I have. I love that I Built You a Tower is almost a callback to that like Crooked Teeth kind of concept, where he had said that, you know, he envisions his life and his experiences as like a skyline. And as these things happen, he like builds a new tower. So whether it's grief, whether it's a happy moment, whatever it is, it's like that's how he's like visualizing these things within his life. So when he's talking about crooked teeth, he's talking about a skyline in the mouth of a man that's devouring us both. When he's talking about I built you a tower, it's like this is the place where I'm going to keep like this grief that I feel over this situation coming to an end. You know, this is where I'm going to keep my guilt about my part in it. This is where I'm going to keep my anger about your part in it. And it's almost a like a compartmentalization of his feelings about the whole thing. And I think it's a really clever way to do songwriting. I think sometimes you can go too far into that sort of thing. It can feel very gimmicky, you know, and I think there's a lot of artists that do that, where they get this idea and then they feel like they force it. You know, this seems to me, this idea of a skyline of his life and his experiences, this is something more that feels like it dawned on him more than it is that he's like forcing this to be the case. And he's like, oh, I got to find a way to describe this. Let me do it this way. It's like the difference between early Bob Dylan and like whatever the fuck was going on in the 80s with Bob Dylan, where it felt like he was really like forcing that. You know, and I think there's certainly stronger eras of Death Cab than others. I think any Death Cab fan will tell you that. But it's funny because it's always going to be different for any Death Cab fan that you talk to. I think Transatlanticism is always going to be like a number one, but whatever other people think is equal to that or equivalent to that is going to change depending on who you're talking to. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about his songwriting, is because as you listen through those albums and all the way up to this one, is like you can find commonalities between them, but you can really like define the eras of his life based on like what you're listening to at that time.
Yeah, and I think that's especially true. Like I'm looking at Punching the Flowers, and that for me feels novel. It feels like you said, a conclusion he had to arrive at, not manufacture. Like he's telling it in the third person in his search for the end of the circle. He kept arriving back at the start. So like thematically, we're talking about this same thing, these cycles of angst and insecurity and kind of a restlessness about either the past or the future. And he is obviously talking about himself, and it's easier to talk about himself in the third person through this character, and it allows him to like really be honest and use his lyrics in a clever way. I love the chorus. It always seemed like he was punching the flowers, ruminating like a fatalist for hours, with a voice like the sound of slamming doors. And you go into the second verse, it seemed he had mildew on his soul from standing at the coastline wishing it would swallow him whole. Again, these great images, these great rhyme schemes, everything like flows seamlessly, which can only tell you one thing, is coming from a very authentic, connected place. And that, I think, is where the Death Cab songwriting shines. is when they're making like their most honest and authentic take on something that clearly is near and dear to them, and then putting it to like these really kind of simple, when you break them down, these really simple indie rock songs. And you could almost say that there's like a formula. And I wouldn't say that the music is formulaic, but you kind of know what beats and kind of flourishes you're going to get from the music and the instrumentation. And there's comfort in that. So they find a way to not have to radically reinvent their sound, but steer into it, play to the strength while finding something totally novel to say and about a whole new part of their life. I think there are a lot of bands that don't successfully make that leap. Like, I don't know if you listened to the new Paul McCartney.
No.
I did. And that was a trip down memory lane for a much older man, and it didn't land with me. Not even because I thought he was like being forced or inauthentic. It just it didn't click because there weren't like new musical ideas, and he wasn't even like falling back on the ambition of some of the biggest stuff he's ever done. It felt inessential. And Death Cab has not had that problem for 2 albums in a row now. They've really kind of rounded into this third act, if you want to call it that, for the band in a post Chris Walla world, and it's working out pretty well for them. It's pretty exciting to get Asphalt Meadows and this back to back.
Yeah, and I think this, to me, I think I do like this album a little bit more than Asphalt Meadows. I think just because I think Asphalt Meadows is just a really good listen. I think this is a lot better about, giving you a look into what really drives Ben Gibbard as a lyricist, as a songwriter. I think it's, the song Riptides, I think, is some of the strongest like lyrical content on the album. These days I say goodbye without opening my mouth. I just stare into the distance till you figure it out. Because I feel as invested as a border guard who's seen too many people leaving to take it to heart. I think there is there's an acceptance of his part in these things that maybe you didn't see that acceptance in previous albums, where that, there was a lot more of a lashing out and kind of blaming the other party for things. And, there was some parts of him that always would take responsibility for that, but I think he was using that as fuel for songwriting. Here on this album, it feels like he's using the songwriting as an outlet, as like, these are feelings I have. I've clearly hurt people. I clearly don't have everything figured out. And so I need to find a way to explain that. And since I can't do that in my real life, I'm going to write these songs. And he has, in the bridge, I think, is one of the most telling ones. And though I'm feeling fine, roughly half the time, there's a fatal flaw in my heart's design. And I think it's his realization that as much as the other people might have a hand in things going poorly, whether it was Zooey Deschanel or the latest one that he was married, I think it was almost a decade that this last marriage lasted, and however long they were dating before that. So a good chunk of his life, if he's almost 50, that's 20% or more of his life. And certainly a part of his life that he felt like he probably had things pretty well figured out. And then this sort of thing happens and you figure out, well, maybe I don't. And maybe at this point now is where that real self-reflection happens, where it's like, at this point, like, can I really blame anybody else but myself? And if they were wrong for some of the things I did, at that point when we got together, shouldn't I have maybe realized that they were going to be wrong for me? And maybe I did force this and maybe it wasn't the right thing. And I think it's, instead of it being, writing about how this is somebody else's fault, I think this is acceptance of his part in it, for whatever part anybody else might have had in it. This album is about acceptance for his part in it.
I like that. I like that a lot. And I think that's totally accurate, because again, if you go back to something like I Will Follow You Into the Dark, that is like almost speculative song. Like, these are the things that I'm, willing to say and do. Crooked Teeth, you can say the same thing, where it's like, you have this person and everything's kind of speculative up to this point, because you haven't like been on the definitive journey the way that a divorced man has. That journey is pretty definitive. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. So now you can only look back on it and tell that story in its entirety. And it totally changes like the whole composition of the album and the way that it talks about these things and in the things it chooses to talk about. But then set to like a lot of different influences. Like we've got like, these great like post-punk elements to How Heavenly Estate, and then you get like synth pop and trapdoor, and we get these like almost like incredibly bitter song, like what's the one called that I really love? Envy the Birds. I really enjoyed that. I didn't the first time I listened to it. I'm like, this is a weak song. And then I listened to it and it no pun intended for a bird song, laid its eggs in my brain. I envy the birds soaring in the silence. This idea of like, I want to be that free and I want to be that unbothered by all of these thoughts and emotions that burden me, because all I have time to do now is reflect. So like taking this complete and painful journey, looking back and setting it to like really like a really fresh, revitalized version of their sound is very rewarding. And then it begs the question, what comes next? And not even in a like industry, like, what do you got next, kid? But what comes next for Death Cab? What comes next for Ben Gibbard? How does this change the songwriting moving forward? Now that you've ostensibly dealt with at least the first wave of these issues, and maybe they're not like fully tapped out on exploring these things, and there's more to come. But it's just as uncertain. We can't be certain that that's what's going to happen. What direction is it going to go in? So as much as it was like a satisfying listening experience, it also invited a ton of questions, which makes it kind of exciting to see what comes next in this like revival era for them. So I think for me, this was an 8 out of 10.
I think I'm exactly where you're at. This felt like an 8 out of 10 because was it as good in my mind as Plans or Transatlanticism? No. If Transatlanticism is a 10 and Plans is a 9, or Plans is a 10 and Transatlanticism is a 9, this feels like an 8, because this feels every bit as good as Asphalt Meadows. It's certainly better than a lot of things that he's done, that Death Cab has done in the past. I think it's solid all the way through. I think there are some lulls. I think some of the production I wasn't ecstatic about. I didn't love, but there's issues like other than like the very early albums and Kintsugi, like there's very few like perfect production albums that Death Cab has done. Like there's always been that almost like punky side to this indie music for them, and I think that still came through. But there's so much on this album that I loved. I think 8 out of 10 feels exactly right for this guy.
Well, there you have it. Pair of 8s. That's kind of what Jeff and I like to call ourselves. Pair of 8s.
Yeah. Well, we did do an episode about Asphalt Meadows. If folks haven't seen that, where could they find it, Alex?
We sure did. There's this little spot on the internet called youtube.com/c/out on that line. It's a fiefdom, if you will, a city state. And it's thriving. We're thriving. The members of the channel are thriving, and the content has never been better and more plentiful, quite frankly. There are some real special treats coming out. We've kind of inadvertently fallen into this rhythm where we're doing stuff like The Brook and the Bluff and one of our upcoming artists at this point, because we recorded the video like 2 weeks ago and I haven't uploaded it yet. We're hanging on to a little sweet treat there. That's probably an artist that you're not that familiar with. So we'll entertain and teach you on this channel. That's a real win-win. It's kind of what Cuomo was doing during the pandemic, right? You were learning something, and he was also being kind of a showman. I don't want to say Jeff and I are like the Cuomo brothers, but you can draw certain parallels here. Just handsome, opinionated, morally correct men chopping it up over a bowl of sauce. Just dragging a hunk of bread through a bowl of sauce at grandma's kitchen table. That's the vibe we put out here at Out on That Line. So hit the thumbs up to like the video. Make sure you're subscribed. Click the bell to get notifications. Hype the video. Share it with a friend. And leave a comment. The comments really super duper help quite a bit. Super key part of this whole thing, gang. So youtube.com/C/out on that line. It's waiting for you.
It's just waiting for you, folks. Reach out and grab it. Till next time.